Alrighty, folks. Today we will be doing another tier list ranking all 9 symphonies composed by the legendary Ludwig van Beethoven. My last tier list did pretty well. I am suspecting that this one will not. I've already done, hip-hop videos, and I just did a rock video with my Journey review a couple weeks ago, so this is, now I'm dipping my toes into classical music. Or maybe I should say romantic, because this is it's kind of on the border of classical and romantic, right? In fact, that's one of the things that made Beethoven such an influential, important composer, was that he was one of the first people to actually usher in the new romantic era, along with people like Mozart. I have a great deal of respect for Beethoven's music, because it's very dramatic and it's unapologetically emotional. So I thought, what better way to show my respect than do one of these tier lists? And of course, if anything goes in the D tier, that doesn't mean that it's bad. I'm just saying that it's not as good compared to the other symphonies on this list, because it does have some, all of these have some pretty tough competition with one another. So with that being said, I guess we can go ahead and start off with Beethoven 1. The first symphony is sort of basic and, dare I say, pedestrian compared to the ones that would follow. It's almost like he said, okay, let me just do a milquetoast symphony so that I can get freaky with the later ones. And with that being said, it's very competently constructed. The sort of moving dominance in the beginning of the symphony is a pretty nice introduction. It's almost like whenever a movie decides not to reveal the protagonist until like 3 or 4 scenes into it. The themes in this symphony are present, and they're memorable enough to sound vaguely familiar whenever they reappear, but not quite memorable enough to stick with you after the first or second listen. You can definitely get a taste of his love for extended codas at the end of the second movement in particular. And in fact, the end of the third and the fourth movement are also pretty rhythmically exciting, with some modulations going on there. The climax of the symphony is almost foreshadowed by the sort of parallel minor switcheroo near the end there. But the build-up to the finale in and of itself is a little bit unceremonious, and dare I say, like, almost non-existent. But it's still a pretty good piece of music in general. It doesn't quite measure up to the other symphonies, though, which is why I'm going to put it in the D tier. Yeah, I do think that Beethoven's first symphony is probably his worst one, which is pretty good, because, that means that he only gets better from there. Indeed, the second symphony is a pretty sizable step up from the first one, I would say. It's immediately more experimental, for sure. I mean, you have that abrupt change into the triple meter after the introduction there. I think the exploration of themes is a lot better executed now. Of course, you have that one melody, bum bum ba-da, ba-da dun 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 da. However, I think some of these movements are a little bit too unfocused still, for my taste. Beethoven in this symphony establishes his habit of stating the minor analog of a theme as a transition into a new musical tangent, which is a technique that we will be seeing frequently in some of these later symphonies as well. The third movement has this pretty fun melody in 6/8. It's pretty fast melody, and it has lots of different variations. It's probably my favorite movement from this symphony. And I would also say that the fourth movement is very energetic and dynamic as well. Lots of exciting things are happening. Maybe at the risk of sounding slightly disorganized. But with that being said, it is clearly a step up from the first symphony, so I'm going to put it a tier above that, probably at the bottom of C tier. I would give the second symphony maybe like a C minus. So Beethoven's third symphony was supposedly based on Napoleon Bonaparte, which is a decision that he immediately regretted for obvious reasons. He actually changed the name of the symphony to Eroica, which was apparently a misspelling of erotica, so that's a fun little anecdote for you. But getting into the music itself, this symphony begins with a very triumphant flavor. It's definitely more dramatic and rhythmically interesting than its 2 predecessors, at least in the beginning. In the first movement, there's this section that builds up to an extremely dissonant chord, which was honestly kind of surprising considering Beethoven's style. I would say that we catch a solid glimpse of the extent to which Beethoven's emotional intensity can grow with this piece. The second movement is definitely more of a slow burn that kind of takes its time developing its ideas into these eventually grandiose culminations with maybe darker and richer chord voicings. But of course, the consequence of that is that sometimes it can seem a little bit more wandering. And if it were just from the first two movements alone, it's probably on the same level, if not higher than the second symphony. But actually, I think that the third and the fourth movements kind of lose the plot a little bit. I'm going to have to say that the third symphony kind of falls off in the second half. So I'm going to put it down here with the first symphony in the D tier, but it's going to be above the first symphony for sure. Just moving forward to clarify, the farther left something is on a given row, the better it is in my estimation. So, we have these three at the bottom here. And honestly, after the third one, it's really only up from here. I actually do think that Beethoven's first three symphonies were probably his worst ones. The fourth symphony is probably the first one that I, consistently enjoyed all the way through. The beginning of it is very eerie and sparsely arranged, which gives it sort of this spooky feeling like, oh, this one's kind of different from the other ones, huh? But of course, Beethoven wastes no time getting into the thick of it. We have a very infamous melody in the Beethoven canon here. Yeah, it's a great melody. I would actually say that in this symphony, whenever Beethoven is trying to present a new theme, it's actually much clearer than it was in the past. And I know a lot of people would argue that that's a little bit less subtle and less artistic. But, as a person who really appreciates melody more than anything else in music, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate a cut and dry statement of the melody because otherwise, I can find myself getting a little bit lost in the weeds sometimes. The first movement is definitely very thematically rich. And the transitions are pretty frictionless as well, even across meters in the second movement. The third movement has these pretty neat chromatic figures that kind of dance around and provide this pretty interesting contour. I mean, I would say that the whole symphony actually plays with the idea of syncopation in pretty consistently interesting and whimsical ways. Yeah, I would definitely put this above all of these three, probably even in the B tier. You don't really hear a lot of discourse about the fourth symphony from this catalog, but I think it's probably one of the most underrated Beethoven symphonies. All right, we have arrived at Beethoven 5. Did you expect anything else? In my opinion, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is easily his best one, and unfortunately, it's just not even close. I mean, there's a reason why this symphony is so referenced and acknowledged in pop culture even today. I mean, the first movement alone is just masterfully thematic. It's leaps and bounds above everything that came before it. It's an absolute masterclass on development and variations of a rhythmic motif. The sort of cyclic repetitions of the rhythmic figure are immensely satisfying, and the harmonies that they occupy are totally flawless and really tasteful. The reason this first movement is so iconic, I think, is because it's so singularly focused on developing its themes without any wasted motion. And, I do love a lot of moments from these first four symphonies, but I can't really say that they have the same level of focus as the Fifth Symphony does. The second and third movements are also incredibly melodic. Whenever the second movement restates its main theme, it's just so triumphant, and it feels like we've arrived, And some of the later parts of that second movement are just so gorgeous. I think the melody in the third movement is actually probably the best Beethoven melody that we've heard yet. Dun 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 dun. Of course, there are rhythmic callbacks to the motif in the first movement as well. The little chugga 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 figures in the cellos are also really fun. And of course, you have that one serene section, sort of calm before the storm moment of the end of the third movement going into the fourth movement, which is an incredibly seamless transition, which goes into this super victorious beginning, and it just feels like a total victory lap. I mean, it feels really good. I love the 1, 2, 3 bass motion in the fourth movement. Usually in that sort of line cliche, you will have like 1 going to minor 2, going to 1 in first inversion. But instead of minor 2, he actually uses the 5 of 5. And so all 3 chords are major, which is sort of an unconventional twist on a very common rising pattern that I think makes it all the more triumphant. It feels like the end of a journey. Yeah, I definitely think Beethoven achieved his full potential on this one. I mean, the ending is comically stereotypical of his love of extended codas. I mean, it's almost a parody of itself. But all in all, like, every single movement is incredibly focused, and it's definitely far and away my favorite Beethoven symphony of all time. I think there's only one symphony in these remaining 4 that even comes close to rivaling it in terms of quality. So moving on to Symphony number 6, aka the Pastoral Symphony. This one actually has 5 movements, which is a pretty interesting structural change of pace. We have a nice major melody at the beginning, starting off with some really warm and cozy chords. The voice leading, I gotta say, is very clever, as motives are being tossed back and forth between the instruments, and there are counter melodies running rampant across this thing. I would say that the transitions are probably the smoothest they've ever been. The second movement, I think, is very meandering. It kind of loses the plot for me. It's honestly kind of boring. But we're back in business with the third movement, which starts off with a really solid major theme. There's lots of fun, like hemiola passages happening in the third movement. There's also another seamless transition into the fourth movement, which then explodes into this dramatic series of sustained chords. And of course, you have another seamless transition into the last movement. Dun 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 dun. That's just a really sweet melody, isn't it? I don't use the term beautiful lightly, so I guess I'll just have to save that word for a different melody. The soft ending to this symphony is definitely a nice change of pace, though. I think it fits pretty well with the general vibe that we're going for here. Yeah, definitely a pretty good symphony. I would have to put it probably in the B tier, along with the fourth one. I'll put it above the fourth one. And now we have Beethoven 7. The Seventh Symphony is a very good symphony. I think it's definitely one of my favorites. There's this really cool whole note theme at the beginning, and a great, very memorable melody follows it. It's developed into all these awesome variations. I love that the melody is unapologetically repeated several times throughout the movement. That's definitely what I look for in classical music. And the minor versions of the melody later in the first movement are also just totally brilliant. This movement also has one of the best endings. It's very creative. The build up to it is very exciting, and it's much more than the usual 5-1, 5-1, 5-1, 5-1, 5-1. The chromatic contour in the second movement also leads to a really great melody featuring these parallel chord changes. You've got that really nice quick staccato melody in the third movement that's sort of contrasted by a very dramatic legato theme that's stated later on. The fourth movement starts off very exciting and dynamic, and once again, it has a great melody, and it lends itself well to the bombastic nature of the final movement. I mean, you'd think it was a rock song with how much the second and fourth beats are being accentuated. I would say that this Seventh Symphony is the best symphony when it comes to melody, which is very important to me. I mean, I've mentioned in previous videos that melody is the single most important aspect of music for me, and I would say that the Seventh Symphony definitely has the best melodies of any of these pieces of music. And I mentioned before that there is only one symphony that rivals the fifth one to me, and that is definitely the seventh one. I think the seventh gets a very solid second place, a very respectable silver medal, and I'm putting it at the very top of A tier. The penultimate symphony of Beethoven's body of work is one of the least talked about symphonies in his second half of symphony composition. And, I think the reason for that is it's just kind of underwhelming compared to the other projects in this era. It's not as memorable. It's kind of a short symphony as well, which I have no problem with. I mean, I love short pieces of music as much as the next guy, but I think it just doesn't make as much of a statement as 5, 6, 7, or 9. The first movement is very bouncy and fun. I mean, there's lots of clever transitionings happening there. The second movement actually tricks you into thinking that it's 6/8, but it's actually in common time. There's this very stately Lydian melody that's going on here. The third movement actually features one of my favorite Beethoven melodies of all time, and it's this very leapy eighth note pattern. I also enjoy sort of the jovial whimsy of the fourth movement. Yeah, again, it's a solid symphony, but just compared to these other ones in the second half of his career, I gotta say that it's probably in the C tier. You know, I would put it below the fourth one, but it's probably above the second symphony. I'm gonna put it at the top of C tier. And finally, we have one of the most legendary pieces of music of all time, which is Beethoven 9. I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say that this piece of music single-handedly changed the world. I mean, the opening to it is just so epic. Like, everything has an extra sense of urgency to it. There are all of these really interesting rhythmic motives that are just extensively explored throughout its run. The fast 6/8 melody in the second movement is pretty mildly enjoyable, along with its variations. There's also this pleasant major secondary melody in the second movement as well. I've heard some people describe the third movement of this symphony as contemplative, and that makes sense because I found myself contemplating whether or not it was ever going to go anywhere. Sorry, that was low. Yeah, of course I'm not saying that this is incompetently written in any way, shape, or form. This is very much a personal preference thing. The melodies and the themes in this movement are presented in such a long, drawn out manner that they are barely recognizable. But of course, the fourth movement of this symphony is a canon event in history, I would say. I mean, it's long enough to be its own symphony, and it's definitely what makes this piece notable in the first place. Beethoven is laying his soul bare for everyone to see with this movement, and there are absolutely no holds barred. The Ode to Joy melody is famous for a reason, and you know what? I refrained from using this word with the previous melody that we talked about earlier, but I think I have to admit that this melody is beautiful. And whenever the vocalist comes in, it always catches me off guard. Like, the choir is expertly built up to with his solo entrance. And I think you could say that this is one of the greatest plot twists in symphonic history. Just the fact that the choir comes in, it's a very coming of age moment. And this isn't a problem with Beethoven, by the way, but I just want to say, like, every single vocalist that I've ever heard on Beethoven 9 has way too much vibrato. And I realize that is what they're going for. Like, they are intentionally using that much vibrato, but it just drives me up the wall. With that being said, the Ninth Symphony is definitely a grand finale in its own right, of epic proportions. It's sort of a culmination of everything that came before it. And honestly, like, if we were just judging all of these symphonies based on their first three movements, I would probably put the Ninth Symphony like somewhere here in the B tier, like in the middle of the pack. But just because of that last movement, just from that fourth movement alone, that really elevates the Ninth Symphony up to the A tier. I think the Ninth Symphony definitely deserves a healthy bronze medal. So there you have it. This is my Beethoven symphony tier list. It turned out pretty symmetrical, all things considered. And of course, as always, let me know what I got wrong about this list in the comments below. I always love to hear you guys talk about music and art in general, and I am forever grateful that people on the internet, for some reason, care about my opinions. This tier list was definitely a fun one to make, going back and listening through all of the Beethoven symphonies. It gave me much more of an appreciation of his music. You know, in the past, I've sort of struggled with enjoying Beethoven's music, just because he is not necessarily one of the composers that is known for his melody writing. However, listening to all of these again, I can definitely recognize the fact that he is one of the best, if not the best composer when it comes to drama, voice leading, orchestration, and rhythmic intrigue. All right, guys, I guess that's about all I have to say for now. So, if you guys want me to do another tier list in the future, let me know that in the comments. Maybe, some discography of some band, or, fast food restaurants, or types of ballpoint pens. Okay, I'm going to stop saying words now. Goodbye.